Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure and honor being here. And after a long working day, I do feel my responsibility. So I'm trying to do my best to summarize this topic, this transatlantic network of authoritarian populism in terms of the Hungarian example and the connection between the Hungarian authoritarian populism and the US. Let me start by saying that this is a very wonderful event in a very wonderful and important timing, because this transatlantic authoritarian populist movement and the internationalization of the authoritarian populism is a very important topic, not just from theoretical perspective, which is my assumption, but from political perspective. So in this respect, I do feel my responsibility as well after the fourth supermajority of the Orban regime. First of all, I would like to speak about in terms of the project and the introduction of this sub-topic of my research. After that, I put an emphasis on the comparison between authoritarian populism, or the emerging of the executive power, and the presidentialization, or a so-called phenomenon of presidentialization. The third point is about the ideological and political networking between Trumpism and Orbanism. And after that, if we have enough time, I'm trying to put some food for thought on the floor for the further research and further debate. First of all, this would be a sub-project in my wide research, my postdoc research, which is about the state emergency in the era of global ecological and pandemic crisis. The last piece of this research is here, which is a book at Roman Littlefeld's Hungarian State of Exception, and tried to collect the theoretical basis of neoliberalization of Hungary and Central and Eastern Europe as well. And I find the root in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. It's not the main point here, but I collected two main assumptions, which is very important in this sub-project of transnationalization of authoritarian populism. The first one is the embedded neoliberalism in Central and Eastern Europe. It is a very, very important point. And from theoretical perspective, it could be very interesting that the roots, the theoretical roots of Western-style neoliberalism, is embedded to the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. It's a very interesting phenomenon. The Vienna Circle and so on and so forth. So it's a theoretical hot point. And the second point is my current, in concern with my current topic, is the exceptionality. The exceptionality in terms of the governance, the exceptionality of authoritarian populism, and the exceptional tool of governance used by authoritarian populism. So this was my wide range research. And I wouldn't call it at this stage a hypothesis, but some kind of framework. And this could be in terms of the transnationalization of authoritarian populism. So there is an emerging phenomenon. There is an emerging phenomenon of networking authoritarian populism, which is very important in terms of our core challenges, the overlapping crises, and the third point is about the mentioned exceptionality, because as I put forward, and this would be my main thought here, that authoritarian populism and the network of authoritarian populism is about not to solve the overlapping crisis of our time, but to manage it as a never-ending state of exception. So the populist side guides, at least to my intention and according to the literature, is based on the so-called rise of the political leader and authoritarian populism based on this phenomenon. And I would like to put two elements here, the mentioned exceptionality and relying on the permanent state of exception, and the internationalization, and not transnationalization. It's a very important phrase. It is not a transnationalization, but it's an internationalization of authoritarian populism, at least to my intention, creates a very, very interesting, on the other hand, very, very dangerous phenomenon of our time. Second point is about a very, very important distinction between the so-called presidentialization and the authoritarian populism, or internationalization of authoritarian populism. From the US side, I do not have enough time to elaborate this, but it is also very interesting that from the US perspective, the theoretical basis, more or less, is a unitary executive theory. Perhaps you are familiar with this topic. This is about the presidentialization. This is about the separation of powers, and this is about, on the other hand, the neoliberalization of the governance. The well-known and very cruel and brutal example is the war on terror, the so-called torture memo, and of course the situation after 9/11, and of course the war on terror and the situation of Guantanamo. As George Agamben puts forward, this is a very brutal procedure when the executive power uses its power to create modern forms of homosacre. It means that these people are subject of the raw power, and this is very, very important from this political perspective. These people do not have legal existence. So this is, I will take back at a certain point to Carl Schmitt. This is a pure existence of the political sovereignty. And from this perspective, this is a very, very important point, and this would be very interesting from the European perspective. What is the executive power in a crisis time, and how this executive power empowered to do, and the emergency situation can change this or not. So what is the executive in terms of emergency situation? The right-wing authoritarian populism, at least in Central and Eastern Europe or in Hungary, went further, and this would be my main assumption in the mentioned book, that the so-called separation of war from peace has collapsed. The consensus around this separation has collapsed, at least from the migration crisis in Hungary in 2015. There is a very important right of emergency power. The war and peace situation are mixed up, and there is a constant and overlapping state of exception. And it is also very important, as I mentioned before, authoritarian populism, and even more, the internationalized authoritarian populism is not interested in to solve this problem. Of course, for instance, the climate and ecological crisis is an objective crisis, but on the other hand, for instance, the migration crisis, at least to the Hungarian example, is a handmade crisis by the political regime. For instance, you will see that from 2015, there is a constant state of exception in terms of the migration in Hungary, which is a very brutal example, this never-ending state of exception. Some networking between the Hungarian and Trumpist side. The main common point, of course, the mentioned Schmittian roots, Carl Schmitt and his theory on the political, or das Politische, and the prevailing of the sovereign, prevailing of the political situation. And the well-known situation is the fight in terms of sovereignty, and the executive power prevails in this situation, as Carl Schmitt proposed. Sovereign is who decides on the exceptional situation decides on the exception as well. And this is the situation in Hungary. We do not have enough time. I try to elaborate this dimension book and other studies that from 2015 there have been 4 kinds of overlapping state of exception, one in terms of the mass immigration, one in terms of the coronavirus situation according to the 3 waves. There was a very short period in terms of the health crisis emergency, but the government diminished this. And the 4th one is a very new one with a new amendment of the fundamental law. This is the state of exception in terms of the war or Ukraine situation. So it is a very important phenomenon that this endless emergency situation realized or embedded that the authoritarian populist regime are addicted in terms of the exceptionality. And take a look at the US situation, take a look at the attack on the Capitol, take a look at that the exceptionality is totally deformed our normal situation, or we can say that the exceptionality is the new normality. Some very concrete example in terms of the political networking between the Trumpism and Orbanism. Of course, there is a very intimate relationship, not a personal relationship. It is a very important point. It is not a personal relationship. These guys are proficient. It is not a personal relationship. It is not. It's not about that Orban loves Trump or each other would like to have a very common political project. It's about the political interests. So it's a very emerging phenomenon, that political alliance between the background and pundits around Orban and then Trump is a ongoing phenomenon in Hungary. And there are several institutions around this. There is a lobbyist network in terms of the US-Hungarian relationship. The flagship institution is the Hungarian Foundation in the USA. There are several scholarship, several foundation events in terms of to create this lobbyist network. This is one strategy. The other one is hiring American lobbyists, for instance, Tucker Carlson's and other proficient lobbyists to make this authoritarian populist agenda both sides of the Atlantic. And the very last phenomenon is about the political networking situation, organizing or co-organizing event. The last one is the so-called CPAC in Budapest in this spring. This Conservative Political Action Conference was a flagship event of the relationship between Trumpism and Orbanism. And after all, making some conclusions for the further research. As I mentioned before, there is a very important phenomenon which is based on the never-ending exceptionality, which is about the new meaning of the executive power, or the new rise of the executive power, which can be distinguished from the so-called presidentialization. That's why it was my first point. So this is the extraordinary measure in terms of the governance, in terms of the executive power. I would say, at least in the context of the Hungarian phenomenon, some signs show that very similar is happening in the USA, but Hungary is a pure reality. The uncontrolled executive power and the uncontrolled state of exception. So that's why I said that there is some addiction in terms of the exceptionality. The other thing is also very important point, that from the Hungarian side and from the US side as well, there is a theoretical and political pundit structure behind it. So this is not just a political project. For instance, Oscar referred to Gramsci, not just the new left read Gramsci, but unfortunately these guys in Hungary as well. So the authoritarian populist rights pundits rely on Gramsci and the Warren position and the cultural stuff as well. So it's a very important phenomenon. And my last word in terms of this subfield of my wider research is that in the era of overlapping crisis, the authoritarian populist right was able to create international networks. So it is a very important phenomenon that in terms of this globalized crisis, from the pandemic to the ecological and climate emergency, the authoritarian populist right is thinking about this international network. And this would be my main point here, and a warning sign in some manner that this could be a very, very dangerous phenomenon, because the hybrid war situation, the hybrid regime creates a hybrid normality, and this is an ongoing phenomenon in Hungary. The normality and normal and legal and political circumstances have been suspended, at least from the migration crisis, and who knows what the next step in this uncertain authoritarian populist regime. Thank you for your attention.